This is a video about how the Bible talks about genitals and the euphemisms that go along with it. So I highly recommend that you watch the previous video in this series before watching this one. Link will be in the description below. Every culture has its taboos, topics that have to be spoken around instead of about. But what is taboo in one culture can be perfectly normal in another. In the Old Testament, for instance, while the words penis, genitals, and vagina only appear directly once each, they're certainly talked about a lot through the use of euphemisms. And there was no shyness in talking quite openly about the foreskin of the penis or breasts, both topics that make some people very uncomfortable today. This makes sense. Circumcision, the cutting off of the foreskin of the penis, was essential to being identified as a God-fearing Israelite male. It was part of their religious life, so of course circumcision and foreskins get talked about. In fact, circumcision is mentioned so casually that Paul actually makes a joke about it, saying that he wishes those who focused on circumcision, a word literally meaning cutting around, would instead apokopto, cut it off. Today, however, some translations are so weirded out by the very word foreskin that they translate it out wherever they can. Like the NIV in Jeremiah 9:25, where it purposely changes the text to avoid saying foreskin. Meanwhile, breasts were seen as far more utilitarian than they are today. Most references to breasts are in a context of breastfeeding and seen as symbols of life, like in Isaiah 60:16, or of nurture and comfort, such as when the people are reassured that they will nurse at Jerusalem's comforting breasts. What is often translated as bosom, in fact, isn't even just about breasts, but all of the body that a young child might touch as you cradle them on your lap and hold them to your chest. It's more about snuggles than about sex. But this isn't to say that people weren't appreciative of breasts, however. The groom in Song of Solomon praises his bride's breasts as twin fawns. Just think about that for a second. While Proverbs hopes that every husband will rejoice with the wife of his youth, that her breasts will satisfy him always. However, and this will sound really strange to today's ears, breasts primarily appear to have been considered nice, but only mildly sexual objects that were used to imply sex euphemistically. Like in Ezekiel 23:3, which talks about the nations playing the whore in Egypt, where their breasts were fondled, obviously a sexual thing, but the breasts are used as a euphemism to imply the sex for which prostitutes are actually known. Similarly, in Song of Song, the groom comments on his bride, saying she has a figure like a palm tree with breasts like fruit, and he wants to climb that tree and grab that fruit. Grabbing of the breasts is only the smallest part of what is euphemistically implied. Because euphemisms, then as now, were the preferred way to talk about genitals. The most basic form of which was simply to widen the focus from a specific part of the body to the whole. So a generic flesh can be used, like the circumcision of the flesh of the foreskin, as in Genesis 17:11. A general word for the specific location you don't want to mention. Flesh is also a great example of how a euphemism is not used sexually all the time. It is a normal word that sometimes is used sexually. So not every instance of flesh in the Bible is sexual, or the word becoming flesh in John 1:14 would be really disturbing. But it does shed some possibilities on how two people become one flesh in marriage. Since having sex made you married in much of the Old Testament period, this could be an oblique reference to the literal act of sex, when two bodies, and in particular two genitals, merge into one space. A similar euphemism is simply nakedness, like when Noah got drunk and his son saw his nakedness. Now, this is a problem of seeing his father's genitals, not seeing too high up on the thigh. Exposing the nakedness is even used as a euphemism for adultery in the law code of Leviticus. But again, sometimes nakedness is really just pointing out the lack of clothing and not the genitals that lack of clothing reveals, like in the Garden of Eden, for instance. Getting more specific, and therefore also more explicit, Any part of the body normally covered by a good pair of shorts could be used euphemistically, something that is often translated in older versions as loins. So the judge Gideon is said to have 70 sons go from his loins. Obviously not a reference to his thigh or stomach. Nor in Isaiah, when labor pains are being described by saying the loins were trembling with pain, is the NIV right to say it was the body. In Song of Solomon, the young bride even praises her husband's stomach, saying it is like carved ivory. This isn't about color. She isn't praising that he has a white six-pack. Ivory comes from tusks, mainly phallic-shaped elephant tusks. This is a statement about how magnificently well endowed she finds her lover to be. And if you think that's odd to find in the Bible, though, the book of Job goes way further. Talking about the behemoth, probably the hippo, Job says that his strength is in his loins and power in his stomach. So this is Hebrew poetry, so this is probably a repetition of the same idea, phrased differently for the second line, and it is very unlikely that anyone cares about a hippo's stomach. Its tail is stiff like a cedar makes that even more obvious because the cedar was known as the tallest, strongest, straightest tree around. Literally, the behemoth erects his tail like a cedar. This entire bit is talking about what an enormous penis the creature has. The groin area is also the subject of the best penis joke in the Bible. Rehoboam had just become king from the notoriously womanizing King Solomon, and advised on by apparently immature idiots, he told the people that his little finger was thicker than his dad's loins. Saying his finger is bigger than his dad's waist, like the NIV says, doesn't make any sense. This is bragging about penis size. He's trying to be more manly than his dad, and it costs him half the kingdom. Other instances of this, however, are less clear. In Genesis 24, an aging Abraham requires his servant to swear by the servant putting his hand under Abraham's thigh. Now, this is a regular way of swearing an oath or making an agreement. For instance, all the princes and mighty men put the hand under Solomon. But does this literally mean grabbing the thigh, or is it a euphemistic cupping of the testicles, or swearing while holding the penis of the other man? Either way, it helps explain why women couldn't make contracts on their own. They weren't allowed to grab a man there, and so couldn't sign the contract. Moving down the body, an even more specific euphemism for genitals is feet. Saul exposes his feet to go pee, for instance, and a woman's offspring come out of her feet. Definitely a euphemism for genitals. Because if you're raising up your robe, the first thing you see on the way to the genitals are the feet. This euphemistic use also probably showed up in Isaiah, when the beasts with multiple wings use one set to cover their feet. Surely their genitals are more likely. Or when Isaiah promises that God will use their enemy as a razor to shave the people's head and beards and the hair on their feet. But for all of these euphemisms, most of the time when feet are mentioned, it literally just means feet. Other euphemisms include calling semen water or milk, calling penises horns because they look phallic and symbolize power, as in the Song of Solomon, or in Job when he is mourning and rubs his horn in the dust. This might also be the meaning of Psalm 75, when the psalmist says that all the horns of the wicked will be cut off, but the horns of the righteous lifted up. Certainly there's some double meaning at work, if nothing else. Butts are mentioned in scripture just 3 times, but the references are all to humiliating enemies through cutting away their clothes and showing their butts. Nothing sexual about them. And while there are plenty of laws about menstruation, the most explicit reminder of it comes from Isaiah when he declares that our righteousness is only as good as used maxi pads. And while the uterus is referred to, it is always in the context of pregnancy, as the womb, and did not seem to carry any sexual overtones. Jacob, for instance, gave blessings of the womb and the breast to Joseph, but it is about having healthy babies, not having lots of sex. Though womb is once used demeaningly to refer to the whole person, with each soldier getting a womb or two of their own from the captives. Even more explicitly, the only direct reference to a woman's vagina that I could find is highly contested because it is one of the most confusing passages in the Bible, Isaiah 3:17. So this is a curse that sores will be on their skulls and their something will be exposed and probably lose hair. There are several unknown words here, but the one that we're focusing on is the word that is modern Hebrew's word for the vagina. And it seems to also be found in 1 Kings 7:50 to refer to a hinge. Now, if this doesn't make sense, remember that a hinge back then was a hole in which a peg would fit and grind around. To me, this sure seems to be a curse calling for someone to catch an STD. And this is only a brief sampling of the euphemisms that can be found in the Bible, but I hope that it has helped to open your eyes to how often and how discreetly the Bible refers to genitals, sometimes quite proudly. Next week, I'll be taking a look at how a few euphemisms in Ruth can radically change how we interpret it. But until then, thanks for watching, have a great week, I'll see you next Friday.